Well, hello there everyone, and welcome to another brand new commentary. Now, unless you have the IQ no greater than 6, you probably think like most people that racism is not good, and civil society can do just fine without it. Unfortunately, there are people who have penises no greater than 3 centimeters at length, so that gives them the justification to claim the exact opposite. This is exactly the type of person we are going to commentate on today. Enter friendly liberal neighborhood Achilles Argyle, who made a video about the benefits of racism. Ah yes, if I were to pick someone who might be an authority on why we need to discriminate other people based on characteristics that they have no control over, it would definitely be from a furry who probably frequency 621. They are the most reliable sources to get nuanced information from. Anyway, let's see what this fellow has to say.
Now, before you all grab your pitchforks and storm into the comments section over the title of the video alone, let me just say that of course racism is bad. I wouldn't make a 10-minute video defending something so obviously terrible.
Strange, for a second there the title of the video literally says, "Why we need racism." Almost like the video serves to defend something so obviously terrible.
Generations have been ruined because of racism, and lives are still getting destroyed by it.
Jesus fucking Christ, those feet. Gross. Give the guy some ounce of credit. Oh, if I were to pick someone who would be an authority on why we need to marginalize people on account of their skin color, I would definitely seek some deviant art for affinity artist with a foot fetish. You'd be hard-pressed finding out how credible people who draw fucking Sonic the Hedgehog 5 Nights at Freddy's inflation 4 feet diaper poop porn can be, if we are discussing about race relations in the United States. Not to mention, goats do not have feet, but they have hooves like this.
However, I don't think we should be painting racism as entirely evil, because, well, there's a reason why people are racist.
Whoa, really? I did not know that. Of course there are reasons to be racist. Not good reasons, mind you, but they are nonetheless reasons.
And that's not because people want to be bad, it's because there are objective benefits to being racist.
Benefits for who? Usually, when it comes to benefits, it's usually due to a particular group of people exerting power at the expense of other people, so I guess that's beneficial to an extent. Too bad it actually makes the world a worse place in the process.
And I don't think we should be discrediting these benefits with all this virtue signaling bullshit.
Firstly, are you fucking kidding me? Is that fucking Chanty Binks? Why, in the year of our dear Lord Jesus H. Christ of Nazareth are you showing a picture of Chanty Binks? The anti-SJW bandwagon is an ancient relic of ancient times. Why the hell are you still writing it? Speaking of which, what does your coffee mug say? Are you offended? Fuck, that just screams of anti-SJW YouTube right there. I am getting some really terrible Vietnam flashbacks right now. Secondly, what the hell do you mean by virtue signaling? Virtue signaling is when you performatively express an opinion with the purpose of demonstrating your good character. As it suggests, it essentially just means signaling your virtue. Lots of us virtue signal, whether we realize it or not, and the only time it becomes a problem is when we don't act on what we say. Simply disavowing racism and being anti-racist is not just an act of signaling your virtue, and even if it is, so what? I fail to see how any of that is a problem, even when considering the time when virtue signaling becomes an issue.
Because we are seriously reaching a low point in history without racism.
Yup, we are definitely on a cusp of a low point of history. All that technological and social progress that we've accustomed ourselves to means nothing, because some guy on Twitter said something along the lines of white people. Am I right? Whites are truly the most oppressed group there is. Also, here's a little criticism. When you are delivering your point, at least put some effort into emoting, and not sounding monotone and emotionless. I mean, holy shit, you're making my text-to-speech voice sound more emotional and animated in comparison.
A lot of people don't know this, but racism is actually the natural state for a lot of people.
No, that is not true at all. It only takes one Google search to conclude that racism is taught. No infant is popping out of their mother's womb longing for the lynching of Negroes and mulattoes. It's also been said that the race labels we use are socially constructed. Taking that into account, babies don't have a fucking clue what race is. They don't know what the hell the Congo race, the Nordic race, the Asiatic race or the generic race are. They don't have an embedded pamphlet detailing all the different races of the world that were artificially drawn up by people constructing it. That wouldn't make any sense.
And has been for most of history. By forming exclusive groups, people are able to be amongst like-minded individuals, and the people infight significantly less.
Alright, here are a few things I need to go over. Number 1, people don't form social cliques and groups exclusively based on race purposely. If you know just a little bit about human migration and climate, humans within various geographic locations evolve to adjust their phenotypes in a way that best suits the environment. That's why humans who live close to the equator are more likely to have melanin in their skin, and those who are far away from the equator are most likely to have less of it, etc. It's not their fault that they are in a geographic area with people whose phenotypes looks the same as theirs. It's been set for them since human migration first began. It's only when those people within various climates and regions start discovering various other humans based on that same premise that they start noticing that there are some differences. With that in mind, when you notice that the people within that phenotype have the same type of language, culture, or even religion, you begin conflating their phenotype with their value system and you accustom yourself as being of your stock, most notably your family, groups of people that look the most like you. Having affiliation with your own assigned racial group isn't the same as wanting to burn crosses and lynch Negroes. That's what racism means, and you are conflating both of them as being inseparable. That's like me hanging out with the boys, and you pretend there is a need for sexism. Speaking of which, number 2, race isn't the only means in which people are grouped together. In pretty much every civilization, most notably ancient Greece, the Roman Empire and China, foreigners were all classified as barbarians. They don't have to distinguish themselves from them in terms of race. The nomadic horsemen from the steppes, for instance, had relatively similar phenotypes from the Chinese, so they don't really need to use the race card to justify defending their country. Speaking of which, don't you know your history of Europe? European countries have been fighting for millennia. Europeans, as we understand them, all come from the same Caucasian racial grouping, so they don't need race to justify going to war with one another. Being of the same race most certainly doesn't save them from fighting against each other, so I can't really see your theory of being of the same race saves them from killing each other. Not to mention, when you mean form exclusive groups of like-minded people, you can literally say that about literally every other construct in existence, even down to which anime is your favorite. Third, what the hell do you mean by think the same? Are you implying that each race thinks differently from one another?
This is because people who think the same don't often come into conflict.
Yes, that's correct. Only one problem, Mr. Furry Brawny Diaperfoot Man. Not all people within a socially constructed racial category thinks the same. Wars between peoples within the same racial group are a lot more frequent than wars between different races, so what the fuck?
Grouping together also provides a sense of pride. I mean, think about it. If you're surrounded by people like you, that think like you, and most importantly look like you, then you feel like you belong.
Literally everything you just said, aside from looks, can be applied to every other social construct that we've ever made. Country, religion, language, region, ethnicity, you name it. Out of all of the constructs you could have picked, you chose race. Why? Race and skin color is probably the least significant priority when it comes to forming a civilization. You can argue that religion can give people a reason to believe that you are working for metaphysical allegiance. A theocrat can at least make that argument, and it would make sense. Think about it, if you are surrounded by people who believe in the same sky daddy as you will feel a sense of belonging. But race, as we know it today, was constructed during the late 18th century, and you chose to prioritize it out of all of the things that came before it. I just don't understand how you came to that conclusion.
Segregation is an objective good in its utility because it leads to the formation of ethnostates.
Only one problem with that Mystery 621 artist, race isn't a fucking ethnicity. If you couldn't have guessed, Achilles Argyle is going to conflate race with ethnicity a lot in this video. Ethnicity is completely different from race, even though there may be a few overlaps depending on what ethnicity we're talking about. Also, segregation does not lead to the formation of ethnostates. No internationally recognized autonomous entity arose when Jim Crow was a thing. In the South, where Jim Crow still existed, African Americans still lived alongside white people in the same areas despite being segregated, and in apartheid South Africa, African people lived in separate provinces, but they are not politically autonomous and they lived in extremely poor conditions.
And ethnostates are historically proven to last longer than states that embrace polyethnicity.
Not true. Many states such as the Romans, Ottomans, Abbazids, Persians, and the Macedonians are polyethnic, and they've lasted quite a long time. Once again, with the conflation between race and ethnicity. Alright, since you are a dumbass, allow me to explain the difference between race and ethnicity, because I notice a lot of white nationalists and racist people generally like to conflate the two. Alright, ethnicity. Ethnicity is defined as the fact or state of belonging to a social group that has a common national or cultural tradition. What about race? Race, a group of humans based on shared physical characteristics or social qualities to categories generally viewed as distinct by society. In layman's terms, race is physical, while ethnicity is cultural. The existence of a white or a black ethno-state cannot come into fruition, because there is no single unified white or black culture. German people have a culture, British people have a culture, Italian people have a culture, Irish people have a culture, French people have a culture, Ukrainian people have a culture, Estonian people have a culture, Finnish people have a culture, Russian people have a culture, Serbian people have a culture, etc. What do all of them all have in common? All of their cultures are based on ethnicity, not race. Not to mention how much they've fought amongst each other. The concept of the white race simply did not exist as far as they were concerned, so it would be pointless trying to group all of these countries and classify them into one culture, because what the hell do they have in common when it comes to culture? Christianity. Greek and Roman philosophy. Big fucking deal. The Arabs all have those as well. They even uncovered Greek philosophy for themselves during the golden age of Islam. Speaking of Islam, there are white countries that are majority Muslim such as Bosnia, Albania and Kosovo, so we'll add that. As for black people, there is no unifying culture between black people in the United States, the Caribbean, South America or even Africa. Speaking of Africa, do you have any idea how many fucking ethnic groups there are in Africa? All of them have extremely unique cultures, and they even have unique physical characteristics between each other.
I mean, look at China. They have over 5,000 years of history because they are discriminatory and wary of other races.
Ah yes, non-ethnically homogenized society China. I know we've already established that this person likes to conflate race with ethnicity, but it's still false, if we consider both of them respectively. For ethnicity, there is some grain of truth to it, but it's not entirely accurate. What we call Chinese people are known as Han Chinese, who originated near the Yellow River. China was able to colonize this huge chunk of land throughout its history through a process of Sinicization. What is Sinicization, you may ask? Well, basically, if China were to conquer a neighboring state or people, they would engage in an aggressive cultural campaign to assimilate them into the Han Chinese fold. From culture, to bureaucracy, to language, everything. The process continues until this once conquered people turn into Han Chinese. They've assimilated Turkic nomads, they've assimilated Russian migrants, they've assimilated Korean and Vietnamese ethnic groups, assimilating them into one language and culture. Even considering all of that, China is still pretty damn ethnically and culturally diverse, and there is a whole range of ethnic groups and cultures that remain. From the Tibetans, Uyghurs, Mongolians, Koreans, Manchus, and a shit ton of ethnic groups in southern China, China remains one of the most culturally and ethnically diverse nations in the planet. Chinese people didn't give a fuck about where you came from or what skin tone you had. They only cared about culture, and they would stop at nothing to assimilate a given ethnic group, if they so choose. In fact, that's exactly what they are doing right now. The Communist Party of China is aggressively assimilating the Uyghur population in Xinjiang, and there's been reports of genocide taking place. Yeah, even if we take into account that China only cares about culture instead of race, it's still a pretty terrible and unethical way of doing things, if you ask me. As far as race goes, China didn't care for much about race at all throughout their history. China believed that they were the center of the world, and they've named themselves Shangguo, meaning the Central Kingdom. They believed that the farther away you are from the center of the world, the less civilized you are. Like Rome and Greece, they viewed foreigners in general as barbarians, regardless of skin tone or physical characteristics.
While also cooperating with their own.
No, the Chinese have been fighting amongst each other for a very long time. Anyone who's watched Bill Wirtz's History of the Entire World, I guess video will tell you that China has been breaking up into smaller factions throughout its history, and they would unite into a single entity once again.
China's home again, then it broke again.
China has had this process over and over and over and all over again, and they've had foreign empires come in and unite the Chinese people under the boot of a different ethnic group, who would later be Sinicized. Again, China only cares about Chinese culture, not some racial category thought up by Europeans in the 18th century. As for racial groupings, China has never cooperated with their own in a meaningful way, mind you. Are you fucking kidding me? Do you have any idea about what the Japanese did in Nanking? How about the Chinese Civil War? How about the genocide that is going on targeting Turkic Muslims?
As such, the Chinese have been able to survive for as long as they have.
Refer to my previous statements, they've survived for so long, because they've had a history of Sinicization. It has nothing to do with black people with pants on the ground raping their women.
China is an ethno-state.
Wrong. China is not an ethno-state, not even close. China has about 56 ethnic groups in the country. If China all of a sudden wants to become an ethnically pure nation-state, no Sinicization involved, the ethnic minorities that already live in China will face genocide. This is only taking into account the European version of ethno-nationalism, a population that is purely of that ethnicity, and there is absolutely no outside influence in their gene pool. The problem is that this is not how people organized civilizations in the past, like China. They are more concerned with culture. In fact, this concept of ethnic purity of a nation only arose quite recently back in the 18th and 19th century with the emergence of industry. At that time, nation-states in Europe were thought up as more than just entities ruled by kings and nobles, but as entities populated by a certain type of people with a given language or culture. The concept of nationalism that the Europeans invented later delved into the nitty-gritty, going so far as finding out how ethnically pure you are. Not only that, but they also want to know how white you are, the type of nose shape you have, the shape of your fucking skull, whether or not you have blue eyes, how wide your eyes are, fill in the blanks. This led to the formation of eugenics and the rise of the concept of the so-called Aryan race. In fact, everything that I just described is what the Nazi Party believed. The Nazis were a product of ethno-nationalism that the Europeans concocted relatively recently. They believed that every German citizen must have a pure Aryan bloodline. Contrast this with China, who believed that the people they've conquered must adopt Chinese culture. Imagine, if China had the exact same mentality the Germans had back in the 1940s, slaughtering and genociding other nations to make way for the Han Chinese Lebensraum. They would obviously not last for long, which is why the Nazis only lasted for 12 years. Ethnic purity simply does not exist. Do you honestly believe that the Chinese are a descendant of one single pure bloodline that comes from one particular area of the world? No, they've done it through invading other people and converting them into Han Chinese culture. Every single Han Chinese person is a descendant of a long-lost kingdom that the original Han Chinese invaded and absorbed into their culture. Besides, even if you, for whatever reason, want China to be an ethnically pure nation, not only would you be one of the worst human beings, if that were to occur, you're still going to have a Han Chinese population that comes from various different walks of life during Neolithic or even recent memory, whether it be from Central Asia, Mongolia, Manchuria, etc. Ethnicity is a social construct, and that's why it's cultural.
And referring to what I said earlier, an ethno-state with a racist population.
Yeah, I am pretty sure all 1.3 billion red Chinese are just frothing at the mouth over the thought of black people fucking their women.
Provides a sense of national pride and identity.
Here's something I don't understand about the video. Not only does Achilles Argyle assume that pride is a final and essential good without further explanation, but he assumes that people have to be racist in order to be proud of a country and the people who live in it. Both of these assumptions are incredibly stupid. Firstly, why the hell should racism be a core tenet of being proud of your country? Believe it or not, you can still have a sense of patriotism without losing your mind over miscegenated couples. The United States is the most progressive in the world when it comes to accepting diversity. However, their patriotism is much stronger than that of Europeans. So yeah, what's that about racism being essential to patriotism again? Secondly, why the hell should I believe pride is a good thing, and it is the ultimate goal of people within a given country? I'm serious, you barely laid out any reason why I should believe pride is something we should strive towards apart from it feeling good. Well shit, lots of things can feel good sometimes, doesn't mean it's actually good for you. I don't get it. Instead of basing what we should strive for on the betterment and welfare of all human beings, improving living conditions throughout the world, you chose arrogantly flashing your national or racial identity cock in everyone's face under the guise of pride as what we need to strive for. Why? Sure, you can just sit around and rant about how much you hate black people all you want, while feeling the dose of adrenaline you get from pride for being a good little white boy, but how the fuck does that make your life improve on a fundamental level? Does that make your country's living conditions any better than it is? Does it help the fact that your infrastructure is crumbling? Not to mention, why should I base my whole pride and identity in an ethnicity, or even race for that matter? I'm sorry, but when I think of the things that I am proud of, usually what I would do is look back on my achievements that I've made, not base my entire achievements and being on a select set of arbitrary groups that have been socially constructed. I don't base my entire achievements in the nation state, the borders in which I was born, let alone the skin pigments in which I was born with.
And thus prevents infighting and strengthens the country.
How? How the fuck does racism strengthen a given nation and prevent infighting? Point of personal privilege, Mr. Anthropomorphic Deviant OC. I may come off as an uninformed normal person, but I personally don't believe that racism strengthens any nation or prevent infighting. In fact, I would go so far to say that it does the complete fucking opposite. If the United States all of a sudden had a racist population, all 300 million people got up one morning and started being racist, there will definitely be a whole range of infighting taking place on those grounds. There will be people setting buildings on fire and lynchings taking place, and depending on how bad it becomes, there will be enclaves of people of different races living in vastly different geographic regions within the United States. The very reason why we have concepts like the melting pot in the first place was to prevent infighting on the basis of race or ethnicity, thus integrating everyone into one American identity that bases their principles upon liberty, egalitarianism and fraternity. If there was no melting pot, integration, and the idea that all men are created equal, there would be no American national identity, the very thing that has kept this nation together. There will be no more fellow Americans, there will just be a plethora of people with different artificially constructed ideas warring against each other. I don't know about you, but it doesn't seem like I'm detecting any national unity or strength in this scenario. Your ideas are not only harmful, but they are decadent to the nation that you claim to care about.
When you work, create, and fight, you are doing so for the betterment of the people you care about, your own people, a distinct race.
Okay, how the hell can one work, create, or fight for a race? Work? No thanks, chum. I am an average Joe working 19 hours a day at a factory to which I receive 7 shekels every day from some guy in a top hat, not some artificially constructed category. Create? Ah yes, whenever I create videos, or any other project for that matter, I am not doing it for my subscribers, I am doing it for the betterment of a select set of arbitrary characteristics that define an artificially constructed category that I've been assigned. Fight. Those are fucking American soldiers, and like I've stated previously, America is home to various different peoples from various different backgrounds, including those belonging to different races. So no, I am rejecting your idea that I am doing all of those things for the sake of a category that has been assigned for me.
On a side note, this is why Kurdistan should not be a real country. It doesn't deserve to be one. Kurds say they need independence, but the difference between the Kurds and the Turks is entirely cultural and not racially related at all.
Holy shit, this shit is so stupid. Yes, the difference between Kurds and Turks are mainly cultural, that's why Kurds are a different ethnicity. To further elaborate on how stupid your point against Kurdish independence is, if we were to explore your logic even further, countries like Germany, France, Sweden, Poland, Hungary, China, Japan, Korea, etc. should not exist either, because their means of existing is cultural and not racially related at all. Firstly, every single nation that has ever existed is based on their culture, not race. If everyone placed their civilizational priority on race, specifically the one from the 18th century, none of the nations that we know would exist. There would be only one country for whites, one for Asians, one for brown and black people, etc. There wouldn't be a need for such things like nation states, because they would be placing their civilization in their skin pigments rather than a defined set of cultural differences between each other. I mean, I would assume you believe Turks and Kurds belong in the same racial category known as brown people, and that's why Kurds don't need independence. But what about Arabs? They are the same race by your logic. Why do they get a bunch of independent states despite having the same language, never mind being of the same race, while Kurdistan should get the short end of the deal? Damn.
If the Kurds were to just accept their racial disposition, then they would be a united state.
Except they wouldn't, because then the Kurds have to deal with being oppressed because of their culture and ethnicity. Alright, from what I am getting at from the video, you either believe two things. Number 1, you believe that Kurds and Turks, among other Muslim nations, belong in the same brown people race, and that's why Kurdistan shouldn't be a thing. Number 2, Turks are their own separate race, and this somehow includes the Kurds, as being part of the same race. For the first option, if Muslims are their own separate race, why does Turkey get to exist? Why do any of the nations despite having a history of quarrel with one another get to exist? If Muslims were their own separate race, then by your logic, none of the nations in the Middle East should exist at all either, because the difference between Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Oman, Bahrain, Qatar, Egypt, Libya, etc. is entirely cultural, and not racially related at all. If the Turks, Persians, Arabians, Kuwaitis, Omanis, Iranians, Qataris, Egyptians, Tunisians, Libyans, Algerians, Moroccans, Palestinians, etc. accepted their racial disposition, then they would be a united state. Only one problem with that, they all have different cultures, they speak different languages, and as for the Arabs, they speak vastly different dialects. I am not talking about just smudge differences like the ones between Americans, Australians and British. I am talking about actual differences to the point where you can mistake them as different languages. Yes, that's the type of difference we are dealing with. A real-world example that could be comparable to Arabian dialects would be the difference between Romance languages like French, Italian, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian. The only difference is that Romance languages classify each other as different languages, while the Arabs do not. In fact, there have been numerous attempts in creating a unified pan-Arab state, and spoiler alert, all of them failed. For the second option, conflating language family with race, I'm sorry, Turks and Kurds are not part of the same race, assuming Turkish is its own separate race. Both the Turks and Kurds come from vastly different locations, haplogroups and migration patterns. For the Kurds, they come from Indo-European nomads from the western part of Central Asia. The same language family that brought us the European languages with the exception of Finnish, Hungarian and Basque, as well as the languages in Iran and India with the exception of the southern tip of the same subcontinent. For the Turks, they came much later than the Indo-Europeans, as they come from Turkic nomads that come from Siberia and settled in the Anatolian Peninsula. The Turkic people brought us various languages like Kazakh, Turkmen, Uzbek, Azerbaijani, Uyghur, Altai, and, of course, Turkish. They formed vastly different cultures and admixture to people that previously inhabited those areas. It may not be an accurate measurement when determining the complex history of different cultures and migration patterns, but you could easily argue for conflating language family with race in this case, because the Turks might have brought in Asian and Middle Eastern admixture to Anatolia, while the Kurds brought their admixture from the original Indo-Europeans closely related to Europeans and Iranians. The problem is that your theory falls flat in its face, because now we know that both Turks and Kurds have different admixture that can in some cases make them different races depending on who you ask. Not to mention, Kurds are more culturally and genetically related to Iran than Turkey. Following your logic even further, Kurds should have their own state just fine, unless you want them to join Iran rather than Turkey.
Living within an ethno-state.
And now we're back to ethnicity. Faggot, the very reason why we have ethnicities in the first place is that a group of people have a unified culture. We've spent the last 30 seconds of you explaining why Kurdistan can't become a real country, because they are part of the same race as Turkey, even though that's not even true, and now we're talking about ethno-states. Kurdistan would for all intents and purposes be an ethno-state, so what the hell is your point?
Living within an ethno-state creates an us versus them mentality.
Wait, you're selling that as a positive. The us versus them mentality is used as a negative term, but somehow, in the far reaches of space and time, your brain decided that it would be wise to use it as a positive term anyway. Hopefully you're just jumbling a bunch of words together, because normally people would use it in a negative context. If not, why the hell would the us versus them mentality be a good thing? I don't know about you, but I would rather make the world a much more open and better place than having groups of people insulating themselves against other groups of people, not taking the time to understand each other. You see, my ideal version of the world makes life a more interesting experience, while yours only will see people fearing each other and insulating themselves in their little bubbles. But I'll be fair, maybe you might give a convincing argument for the us versus them mentality, right?
And it's been proven time and time again that having a defined, tangible enemy that is perceived to be pure evil unifies a people.
Sources, dude, trust me.
By comparison, blurring the lines of morality with all this not all black people talk just weakens everyone's resolve.
No, it doesn't. Saying things like not all black people is a far more preferable option than blaming an entire racial group based on a few bad apples, because then you would take more time understanding and solving their socio-economic disparities that led them to do criminal activities. Or, you can be Achilles Argyle, be fucking lazy, and blame an entire race of people as a means of finding the quickest solution. Oh, solving black criminality is simple, just police their communities more. Well, maybe you're right, but then black people will live in objectively worse conditions than they've had previously, because not only are they experiencing generational poverty from slavery and Jim Crow, but they are also experiencing a subtraction of their positive liberties. Already I am devalidating your us versus them mentality, because then I would be proposing something more efficient than consolidating everything into the us versus them mentality or the need to scapegoat a group of people as the quickest means of finding a solution.
Take Osama bin Laden in the War on Terror, for example. People rallied behind the tangible goal of killing Osama bin Laden, and everything was great.
Yeah, I mean granted we did a few unspeakably horrible war crimes along the way, and in turn just created a power vacuum in the Middle East for Islamic terrorists to pop up from time to time, but we can just gloss over that.
But once he was gone, suddenly the enemy was terrorism itself. Not any one group or person. It could have been anyone. What were we supposed to do then? It's not like we can go and just shoot terrorism dead.
Good question, fam. We could, at the very least, I don't know, actually solve some of the socio-political disparities that led to the existence of Islamic extremism to form in failing war-torn states, or the fact that Iraq and Syria were drawn by European colonialists, or how the existence of Pakistan had displaced millions of Pashtuns, among other ethnic groups from Afghanistan, thereby starting numerous wars against the two countries along the way. Maybe try to actually solve those issues that have permeated the Middle East, but no, you would rather be a pestilent child and say, "No, we are the good side and they are the bad side. That's how the world works. Swah 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 swah." How the fuck does that solve anything?
This is why we need people like Osama bin Laden, and groups like Muslims, and why we need to hate them.
Why? Why the fuck do we need radical Islamists causing another terrorist attack against our country? And why the fuck do we need to use them as an excuse to mobilize the entire country against another group of people? It's amazing to me how you can say this and not think that your ideas actually make the world a worse place. There are much more rational solutions to the crisis going on in the Middle East, and they are much more nuanced than just taking on and bombing the crap out of brown people and hoping that the problem will go away. I thought you said that a racist world will lead to a world with less conflict. Why the hell are we fighting another group of people by your logic? Besides, let's say hypothetically that you're correct. Let's say we need a common enemy to bitch about in order to find ourselves in a state of social cohesion and unity within a given nation or group. What about communism? The West has been mobilizing against the common threat of Soviet communism during the Cold War, and our rivalry with Russia still remains relatively the same under President Vladimir Putin. I just gave you a great example about how the West, particularly the United States, mobilized against a common enemy, and it has fuck all to do with race. In addition, it can also be argued that this rivalry has made so much technological and social progress in both sides during the 20th century as well. I don't see you using this as an example on how rivalry with another group could be beneficial. I'm guessing it's because these countries are primarily populated by white people, so it would completely defeat your narrative. Also, let's say hypothetically that you have won. Let's say that the white race has successfully won the race war. Congratulations, not only are you by far the worst human being who has ever lived, but you've won the Great Race War of 2100. What now? You would look for another group to purge, and it's not going to be racially related at all. I mean, why wouldn't you? After all, you gotta find a tangible enemy to rile up the population towards a common goal, thereby forming unity within a population. You see, the us versus them mentality in its extended utility, constantly finding an out-group to fight against, is just decadent and destructive to a nation you care about, because the standards of who gets to live becomes thinner and thinner, because you're in a constant pursuit of an out-group to purge. When it's not other races, you begin purging the disabled. When it's not the disabled, you begin purging political dissidents. When it's not political dissidents, you begin purging people who looked at you funny. When it's not people who looked at you funny, you begin purging the okay, I think you get the hint. This process will go on, and it's only anyone's guess on how far it would go.
The politically correct may preach that globalization is the only way things should be, but a divided world gives states and people true independence, and thus responsibility for our own mistakes and development.
No thanks, bud. I am not responsible for what the people placed in the same artificially constructed category based on a series of phenotypic characteristics, as me do on a daily basis, because I don't base my entire being on a collective.
I know I personally feel that certain races contribute significantly less than others to our culture, such as Mexicans and Indians.
You can't be serious. You heard it here, folks. Mexicans and Indians contribute significantly less to our culture. Are you sure about that, buddy? You're not going to provide a source or counter-argument against something that is epistemologically correct when it comes to the history of this country. I'm sorry, dude, but I'm pretty sure that anyone who has taken social studies for a couple of nanoseconds would tell you that what you're saying is the complete opposite, considering that Hispanics and Indians have contributed greatly to our culture, ranging from food, music, beauty products, sports, clothes, movies, etc. There might be a few things that you don't like about Mexican and Indian culture, but that doesn't change the fact that Hispanic and Indian culture has played a significant role in the cultural development of America for a lot of people.
The best way to avoid this is simply to divide people by race.
Jesus Christ, this guy chose to illustrate the green stench coming out of his feet. Why? I mean, your opinion is already stinky enough, pun intended, but if you're trying to convince people that racism is the only way to go, why the fuck did you insert this in? Okay, first we have a furry Rantsonas crossing his arms. Already we are going downhill pretty quick. People with Rantsonas often espouse really terrible and unsavory opinions, such as this gem, and let's not forget this gem. Strike one. Next, we have the creator casually exposing his foot fetish, and to top it all off, the creator decided to illustrate green stench coming out of his feet. Strike 2. Lastly, and I don't think this has been brought up before, but there are holes coming out of his feet. There is green fumes coming out of the holes of his feet. Why? 3 strikes, you're out. Seriously, Achilles Argyle, what the hell were you thinking? I would just like to explore your mind that tells you that this is good for optics. I'm about to make a video explaining why we need to fucking hate black people and Mexicans. Already that will set people off. I may need to present myself in a way where I can present my opinions in a palatable way so that the viewer can at least learn something new about the subject. What should I do? I know, I will commit every last degenerate trope that you would see from a 2016 DeviantArt rant. I will present myself in a furry avatar, expose my foot fetish, and have green fumes coming out of the holes of my feet. Yep, that'll totally make people want to listen to what I have to say. What fucking good would that do to your side that makes people want to consider your opinions as something worthwhile? At no point did you consider that these things would serve less than just a thought-terminating cliche, us initiating an army of people waiting to put you into their cringe compilation.
The best way to avoid this is simply to divide people by race. Suddenly, there would be no more races writing on the achievements of others, or even the mere perception that some group is leeching off of our own hard work.
First of all, what the hell are you talking about? How can a race, not class of people nor individuals, an entire race, leech off of other people's hard work? I mean, I can think of a few examples of how this can slightly fit your ridiculous and disjointed theory about what's happening. European colonization and slavery most certainly has leached off of the people that have been conquered, especially minerals and natural resources from Africa, and most recently, oil from the Middle East. Another example is with the rise of capitalism, and how it led to the inefficacies that we rarely hear about. There is a great video from Refinery 29, where it talks about how a makeup company is using child labor to make their products, and they are subject to unbelievably poor conditions. So in terms of who's doing the most leechings, it would definitely be white and Asian people, specifically the ones from America and China. I bet you have lots of things to say about this, but how the hell would hating on others for their skin color change any of that? Secondly, wouldn't the perception that people are leeching on others' hard work be a racist idea? You say that segregation and races keeping to their own will prevent that perception, but this video is supposed to be a defense video for racism, and by your logic, segregation will alleviate racism, defeating the purpose of racism entirely. If we explored your logic even further, us ruining the framework of what you view as best for the world.
Racism puts people in check. When you're constantly critical of another race's actions, you're gonna call them out on it at any chance you can get.
No, what I would rather do instead is criticize individuals, keyword, individuals, for their actions, not blame an entire fucking race of people, because one of their own decided to spray paint the N-word in the periphery of KFC. If a person is acting like an asshole, I don't attribute his attitude towards his race nor place the accountability on thereof. I blame them, only them, for being an asshole, because I don't think in terms of collectivism. I don't need to pull out a scoreboard for each race and remove a tally, if that person of that particular race is acting like an asshole, and then say, well, the black race has lost once again, and I remove a tally for the black race, because I don't think like that, because there is no sensible utility in that collectivist way of thinking. You see, I have this really ridiculous way of thinking. It's called individualism. Something that you seemingly have no sense of.
This is far preferable to the alternative of being blindly accepting of all of a race's mistakes.
What the fuck are you talking about? Blindly accepting other races' mistakes? No one is denying that each community within a racial category has their own share of mistakes, but most of these problems are mostly based on cultural factors within a given community, not racial. Sure, there may be some people who are willingly doing that, but they're just as racist as you are, because they believe that the bad things that they do is inherent rather than socio-economical, and we should just accept their disposition and not fix anything. In fact, aren't you supposed to make a case for it? Not being blindly accepting in other races' problems and instead trying to fix them is the ultimate anti-racist thing to do, so what the fuck? But, if you believe criticizing other races is the best way to ensure that their own will improve, let me try to improvise in a better alternative. How about addressing the problems within a given community whose problems are more prevalent rather than criticizing an entire race of people, whether or not they have anything to do with those mistakes within said community? Sure, culture and race can intertwine with one another depending on complicated socio-political factors, but that doesn't mean it's the entire race's fault. If I were to go over to Africa and started yelling at a random African person for violent crimes committed by gangs within the black community in the United States, would that make any sense? How about, if I go over to Norway, and started yelling at a Norwegian person for the crimes committed by the Ku Klux Klan, whether or not they have anything to do with it? We wouldn't do that, of course, because once again, we believe in a little thingy called individualism. I guess, when you mean blindly accepting other races' mistakes, you mean not condemning an entire race of people based on a few people doing a bad thing. What fucking good would blaming an entire race do? Where's the sensible utility in that? Black people's skin pigments don't cause them to leave their pants in the ground and play music really loud. It is all dependent in cultural and socio-economic factors, and other races can do the same thing as well.
This can be seen with the whole COVID-19 epidemic. The virus was caused by China. There's no way around that. It started in China because some Chinese idiot ate a bat, and it spread because the Chinese government was unwilling to be honest about the severity of the virus.
Yes, one individual person caused the virus to spread, and the Chinese government was irresponsibly downplaying the severity of the virus. So that's why we need to be racist against all fucking 1.3 billion Chinese people. We should also be racist against Japanese and Korean people for good measure, because they look like Chinese people anyway. That'll totally make the world a much better place.
In spite of this, people are defending China and shunning away anyone calling the virus the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus.
Firstly, no one is defending China for the spread of COVID-19. Obviously the Chinese government was irresponsibly managing the situation in the first place. What we are saying is that, if you call it the Chinese virus, you are essentially saying that people of Chinese descent are responsible for the virus, rather than pinning the blame on one individual mismanaging the sanitization of their food, as well as incompetency of the Chinese Communist government.
The virus came from China, and it's somehow wrong to call the Chinese out for it?
Yes, because 1.3 billion Chinese are not responsible for some poorly sanitized restaurant serving bats in the middle of Wuhan. While yes, it is true that the virus originally came from China, calling COVID the Chinese virus or the Wuhan virus is not helping the situation at hand, but rather it just stirs anti-Chinese rhetoric, and this might be used against Asian Americans who might be conflated with the Chinese ethnicity. Evidently, there has been numerous hate crimes against Asians since the COVID outbreak first began. When Donald Trump and those like him call COVID the Chinese virus, or Kung Flu, do you honestly believe that he's doing it in good faith? Or is this another instance of him dog whistling against minorities, just like he did with Mexicans and Muslims? The thing with dog whistles is that Donald Trump doesn't have to explicitly make racist remarks, but rather he gives subtle nudges so that the people who already agree with him will know what he's talking about, thereby amplifying their hatred against minorities, so that they will be worse off in society. If someone calls out Donald Trump for calling COVID the Chinese or Wuhan virus, people like you will try to play cover for him by saying, well, the virus originally came from China, does it not, you snowflake? You're right, COVID originally came from China, no one is denying that, so the question is not where the virus came from, but the impact on how Americans view Chinese people, and by extension, Asian people, when calling it the Chinese virus, the Wuhan virus, or, goddammit, Kung Flu. I know you're probably a Trump supporter, and the only thing Trump supporters give a shit about is saying whatever the fuck they want without consequences, but what people like you fail to realize is that this sort of language can have a negative impact on how people view the world, thereby leaving the possibility of damage that would take place.
Blind acceptance in aid of other countries is actively screwing us over. I mean, Africa is leeching resources from the first world, all because some liberal politician sees that their skin color is dark and takes pity on them.
Ah yes, non-liberal politician Geert Wilders. You know, you could be on board with some of Wilders' politics, considering he is indeed an Islamophobe, and has called for the Quran to be banned in the Netherlands.
I mean, Africa is leeching resources from the first world.
Wait, what? Africa is leeching off of the first world? I don't think that's true at all, buddy. Refer to literally the history of the modern world and current socio-political situations of today, and refer to my previous statement in how the West has exploited the third world through capital. Might wanna rethink your theory there, chum.
All because some liberal politician sees that their skin color is dark and takes pity on them.
Sure, Achilles Argyle, non-liberal politicians like Geert Wilders are sending money and food to Africa, not because the children over there are literally starving to death and they are malnourished. Some of the people over there live in shitty conditions, and the equatorial areas are running out of water due to climate change. No, it's just that they feel sorry for them, because they have melanin in their skin. Totally accurate to the socio-political situations over there.
So they funnel food and water to them, instead of the hard-working men, women, and children in their own country.
Bitch, white people are pretty much living off the fruits of a post-colonial world, so I am pretty sure we also at least have an abundance of food and water in our countries. Secondly, Africans are already working hard, even more so than the Europeans and Americans in certain metrics, especially when considering that some countries in Africa allow slavery and child labor. And guess what? They are still dirt poor, and when your country is dirt poor, don't be surprised that there are people in it that are going to do backbreaking work just to make ends meet. Also, I've been meaning to say this since you brought this up. Your portrayal of Africans is pretty much no different from how the Nazis portrayed the Jews. It's the oldest trick in the book, just depict them as a bunch of parasites who are leeching off the system at your expense. The Jews are fucking everyone over, and you, a hard-working German, are paying your tax dollars to sustain them. You don't want that, do you? Perhaps maybe we should do something about them, huh? This is all from the Nazi playbook, and many Republicans throughout the rest of the 20th century are bringing up the old story about welfare queens. You, a hard-working white Anglo-Saxon American, are paying your taxes, while the welfare queens are buying a whole bunch of clothes and funny hats with their welfare money. As it turns out, coming up with a group of people who are financially well off at your expense is the quickest means of riling people up. The Nazis did it with the Jews, objectivist Republicans did it with poor black people, and now you're doing it to continental Africans. Because of that, I now have no reason to believe that you're arguing in good faith. Throughout the videos so far, you are just coming up with obvious scapegoats trying to pin blame on anyone who isn't white, and using it as a reason why we should be racist towards them. It's honestly pretty sickening.
Shouldn't Africa be left to their own devices to figure it out for themselves?
No, as it turns out it's not that simple. The reason why Africa is so poor is because Europe has fucked it over, colonizing their lands and turning them into hubs for their own financial and economic gain. And guess what? Europe looting the hell out of Africa and carving it up into artificially constructed borders has left the continent in a situation where the people are poor, they are malnourished and uneducated. Many of them turn to religious fundamentalism and dictators that brutally oppress their people in return. And depending in which part of Africa we're talking about, there are warlords popping up, many of which supported by the United States. It doesn't seem like the people of Africa are ready to deal with this shit in their own, and it's probably going to take a lot more than just handouts under a global neoliberal system.
Similarly, Syria is pouring rapists and murderers.
Oh god, he's even plucking his nose over the green fumes that are coming from the holes of his feet. Again, you had a thought, and that thought bubble said that you must throw in your repugnant foot fetish. Is that supposed to make me convinced?
Syria is pouring rapists and murderers into Europe, and people are just making the gates into Europe even wider to accommodate them.
Oh great, we gotta throw in the European migrant crisis in there, didn't we? Firstly, the diaspora of Syrian migrants is not a particularly European problem, considering that only 9.6% of the world's refugees are located in Europe, with Germany hosting the most refugees, ranking in about over 1 million. In the contrary, many Middle Eastern nations are hosting more refugees than Germany, with Turkey hosting 3.7 million, Lebanon with 1.4 million, Jordan with 2.9 million, and Pakistan with 1.4 million. Germany has more refugees than the rest of Europe, but Germany ranks only less when comparing it to the crimes committed in France and Great Britain. Britain only has around 100,000 refugees, and they've had the most refugees they've had in the early 2000s, while France is only around half of Germany's. Besides, the only open border policy in Europe is with its own countries, specifically the ones in the European Union. If open borders are the main cause of crime to occur, it would definitely be committed by people from other European countries, and not the refugees coming in from Europe, as there is so few in number.
What a surprise, the rapists and murderers they willingly let into their country raped and murdered people.
Again, let's say that open borders is the main cause of crime to occur, which is basically a given when considering that the Syrian migrants come from terrible socio-economic backgrounds. Why not just arrest the people who are doing it? The only open border policy the European Union has is with its own nations, and if we followed your logic even further, there would have been rapists and murderers run amok, especially from poorer European countries like Romania, Bulgaria and Greece, and given that there are more Europeans than Syrians in Europe, obviously, it's safe to say that Europeans have committed far more crimes than refugees have ever done. Knowing this, it's not controversial to believe that they are well equipped to take on crime in the Syrian migrant community, and contrary to what you're trying to suggest, they don't need to be fucking racist towards Syrians when dealing with those things. You wanna know why there are people who are performatively saying not all insert minority group here are terrorists or criminals? It's because of people like you. You'd rather paint an entire group of people under the same brush as the quickest means of getting rid of the problem rather than going by a case-by-case basis. If you want to apply race or ethnicity into it, fine, try solving some of the socio-economic trends that enable them to do crime in the first place.
Oh, but they can't do anything else because they don't have the same rights as us. Oh, they're like this because of nurture.
Haha, I just repeated your argument in a funny voice. That totally makes my argument seem more reasonable. Swah 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 swah. Yes, I am willing to accept that due to socio-economic factors, some of them will turn to criminal activities or even radical religious politics that will fill the void of their misfortunes. They are refugees coming from war-torn nations, so yes, a lot of them will turn out dirt poor, because they had to leave everything behind so they don't get consumed by the belligerency of different factions within these countries, and there is a correlation between being poor and being a criminal. But maybe I am wrong, maybe you have a counter-argument against these claims that could actually explain what you're talking about.
They say as they continue to let these primates fuck our countries.
Wait, so no counter-argument? Well, so much for that, huh? Yeah sure Achilles Argyle, Europe is just going to let migrants run around raping and murdering people without police intervention. That is totally accurate to the current geopolitical situation that is going on over there. Wait, no it fucking isn't. No European country is just going to let migrants get off scot-free, just to permeate the principle of social justice and equity. Hey, you wanna know what they do instead? Come closer. They arrest the person doing those things. Whoa, really? Yes, believe it or not, they arrest the rapist and murderers, because those things are against the law. Every country has those laws, and no amount of Nazis extrapolating out of context news headlines from Breitbart is going to change that fact. And yes, it's all because of nurture, because, as I stated previously, it's due to socio-economic factors mainly from the fact that, I don't know, they come from war-torn nations whose land at the time has been captured by ISIS. Yeah, what's that about the war on terror turning out great again?
Maybe, if they were told to stay in their own shitholes, they'd find that they have the same rights as in their own countries.
Ah yes, the refugees coming over to Europe already have the same rights in their countries, as the West has with theirs. You see, whenever I think of a place where they value things like equality, freedom of religion, freedom of speech, freedom of the press, I definitely think of areas controlled by terrorist organizations, countries ruled by dictators, and countries governed by theocratic institutions that don't allow women to drive. Damn, such bastions of freedom over there, I wonder why they left.
And they'd figure out that the only way to find a better life is to start by bettering their own land and not by running away from it.
How? They are fleeing from a fucking civil war. What the hell do you want them to do? Fight? No thanks chief, most people want to live comfortable lives. They would rather live in a place where they are not going to have their children be blown to smithereens either by Israel, Turkey or some terrorist with bombs strapped to their scrotum.
In my opinion, the worst offender of all is India. They're pumping CO2 into the world like it's a competition.
Yes, because we need to see which country can destroy the ozone layer the fastest. Since our country is racist, we can't just let some shit-skinned country like India or China try to take away our leading role in CO2 emissions, so we will crank up our fossil fuel economy 300 trillion times more. We may even use the garbage that's in the Pacific Ocean to place our military bases securing our precious oil fields. We are also planning on annexing Brazil, destroying the Amazon rainforest and turning it into a giant field filled with massive power plants whose only purpose is not to make any products anyway, but just to pump massive amounts of carbon into the air, and all of life in Earth will just die. The white race has won once again, number 1 in carbon emissions, and the first race to successfully kill all life in planet Earth is one of our crowning achievements.
They're third in the world in terms of CO2 emissions.
Damn, that sounds like a real problem that India should try to solve. Perhaps we can help them transition from fossil fuels to renewable energy despite their relatively poor socio-economic conditions that can be stretched back to the colonial era. Oh wait, that's not good enough. We need to endlessly bicker about them all the time. I mean, after all, that helps the country unite against a common enemy, something we definitely need.
You know why?
I don't know, because India is relatively poor, and despite almost having the same population of China, their GDP is relatively the same size as the United Kingdom, while China ranks as the second largest economy. I mean, with a country in that sort of situation, you better believe that India is generally dirt poor, and it would be pretty much impractical to cut down CO2 emissions nor transition to renewable energy right away. That would pretty much kill their country economically, if they do that.
It's because they have a culture practically based entirely around being unhygienic.
Haha, I just googled a picture of a dirt poor neighborhood in India. This proves my point that we should start being racist against all fucking 1.3 billion Indian people. Swah 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 swah. I know India is not the most cleanest country in the world because of how poor it is. This is an obvious propaganda technique that is meant to provoke disgust to the viewers, but honestly, this can be applied to literally any other country in the planet. A thing to consider about Google Images is that people can just search up whatever images that best suits their preconceived stereotypes about how the world is. Hell, if the furry furfag who made this video wanted to, he can utilize Google Images to find a clean Indian city to try to prove a point that India is a good country, while contrasting it by showing a picture of a dirt poor neighborhood in Germany. When you show pictures of ugly people from various different races, or trashy cities from poor countries in an attempt to prove a point, that doesn't tell me jack shit, because I know you are just selectively extrapolating pictures that best suits your stupid and ill-informed political beliefs.
They eat shit and drink piss for breakfast.
Only on breakfast time, not lunch or dinner, just breakfast. For lunch, they just eat concrete from the sidewalk, and for dinner, they eat some of the ashes that are left on the cigarette trays. Kind of defeats your own point, if you're going to externalize your poop fetish, as if your foot fetish wasn't bad enough.
Take a wild guess as to what happens to the world when a country with this kind of disgusting culture industrializes.
Okay, what the fuck does this graph have anything to do with India industrializing in particular? The entire world was already industrializing during the 20th century anyway, therefore susceptible to emitting CO2 in the atmosphere. The reason why annual emissions are starting to go up during the 20th century, as depicted in this graph you extrapolated, has a lot to do with the rising birth rates after World War II. With a rising population like that, you better believe there is more demand for agricultural and industrial arms to serve the rising population. The Western world, the Eastern Bloc, Japan, China, Africa, and yes, even India, has experienced this population growth, although some experienced it much less than others. So it's less of an Indian problem, but it's pretty much the fault of literally every industrial country in the planet. I'm not saying that we shouldn't say something about India's dependence on fossil fuels. Like China, they are not any better than the rest of the world when it comes to climate change, but it is important to know that it all comes down to, say it with me now, the socio-political situation in India. India already has a monetary incentive for using fossil fuels, so it might take a while to get them to switch to green and renewable energy.
But all of these people get a pass with the wave of a hand because they're minorities and they're being marginalized.
Jesus Christ, you're even doing the air quotes with your fucking toes. Fucking hell, man. And no, we are not giving them a free pass with a wave of a hand. We are just as critical of them for pumping out CO2 into the atmosphere as we are with every other industrialized country. What we are not doing, however, is using their race as a crutch. Believe it or not, you can still address India being third in the world in CO2 emissions without being racist. Whoa, who would have thought? As it turns out, actually addressing the issues and hoping to cooperate with other nations in an attempt to transition to a much more cleaner world is a much more effective idea than resorting in a constant us versus them mentality in an attempt to make the population stupid and ignorant as a way of putting forth human cohesion. Which way Western man, actually solving the issue through cooperation, or an Orwellian 2-minute state session against another group of people. which is more likely to ensure that the human race survives in the next 100 years. This is one of the things that pisses me off about the video. This video is supposed to convince people that being racist is a good thing, when you are not even providing or suggesting anything that could make the world a better place at all. Hell, I could just come up with all of the solutions to problems that you pointed out in this video. For the migrant crisis, we should have the UN conduct a peacekeeping operation to fix all the failing war-torn states and make them sustainable again. For India, we should find a way for India to invest in green and renewable energy. There, I came up with actual policy positions, however shallow they may be, and I didn't even have to think hard about it either. Achilles Argyle pointed out all of these problems in a video called, Why We Need Racism. How the fuck would racism solve any of those issues listed above? Should we deport the Syrian migrants back to their failing war-torn nations so they can be slaughtered by ISIS? Should we start going to war with India, even when they are still pumping CO2 into the atmosphere? You see, whenever you try to present racism as the quickest solution to these problems, you're going to get some really unethical results. By the same token, you also pointed out that the international community is handing out money and humanitarian aid to malnourished children in Africa, as if it were a bad thing. Okay buddy, what is your alternative? I mean, this video is called, Why We Need Racism. Should we start being racist against those malnourished children? If so, what the fuck is wrong with you? That seems a little excessive, don't you think? Most people, when they are confronted with the idea of children starving in Africa, many of them would actually be supportive of helping them. If you're trying to convince people that we should start being racist, you're doing a fucking terrible job when you bring this up as an example.
And don't even get me started on black crime statistics.
Good, you're saving me the troubles of me having to pull out all of the actual reasons for why black crime statistics are the way they are, and I would probably say the word socioeconomic throughout the interjection. I know it's a common meme by Nazis for reasonable people to refer to socioeconomic factors when explaining stuff like this, but let's face it, it makes hell of a lot more sense if you look into it with that in mind, versus hooking your brain towards 4chan and Stormfront articles all day, referencing old pseudo-scientific race science articles put together by dinosaurs 1,000 years back.
Admittedly, white people do have their own shortcomings too, though they are less drastic than other races. They've only ruined pizza and Italian carbonara, which weren't too good to begin with, so not much loss there.
Yes, the only thing white people did wrong was that they ruined food that were already invented by Europeans anyway, full stop. I mean, it's not like, I don't know, white people throughout history have committed genocides against other groups of people, right? Let's just forget all of that.
If you've stuck with me thus far, then I need you to bear with me again, as I realize what I'm about to say may sound bad.
Wait, what? It gets worse? You've already said some really disgusting and offensive shit thus far. I can't really imagine it getting any worse from here. I mean, your feet isn't creating a green fume anymore, so I suspect it's not going to be all that bad. Right?
Nevertheless, I have to say this. Slavery is good.
What?
Every great civilization is built on the shoulders of disposable workforce.
What about Egyptians? Did you know that the people who worked on the pyramids of Giza were not actually slaves, but laborers and masons who worked on the pyramids voluntarily? It's been a perpetual misunderstanding throughout history that the Egyptians used slave labor to build the pyramids, but recent archaeological studies conclude otherwise.
And it's even better if this workforce is perceived as having less rights than a regular citizen.
Sources, dude, trust me. Dude, other civilizations used slave labor, and a lot of it has fuck all to do with them being of a separate group identity, let alone being of a different race. Sure, let's say that these great civilizations are built on the backs of people perceived to be of lower class, like serfs or slaves. These great civilizations considered foreigners barbarians by default, so the likelihood of them considering the idea of certain people being racially inferior, therefore ought to be exploited for manual labor would seem unlikely. Again, Egyptians used volunteer work to build the fucking pyramids, and they are renowned as being one of the 7 wonders of the world.
And this loops back to my main point, why we need to bring back racism. Racism desensitizes us to slavery. During the golden age of America, slavery was running rampant, and no one batted an eye.
Ah yes, no one batted an eye, except maybe the abolitionists in the 19th century. Not sure about that buddy, I do believe many people batted an eye even during the time when slavery was more acceptable.
And this was because blacks were considered less than human thanks to 3/5 compromise. That compromise let the American people take advantage of them without any adverse psychological effects.
Yup, no detrimental psychological effects ever came from slavery, no childhood neurodevelopmental trauma or any general psychological trend that have left many slaves to reconsider their purpose of life, nor do they have to deal with a fragmented identity or compromising their human worth. No, seems like none of that exists for us to document. Imagine being this much of a fucking idiot, dude.
giving industry a massive boost and allowing America to develop into the superpower it is today.
No, slavery has been around much longer than the Industrial Revolution. Not to mention, slavery mostly exists in the agricultural South, while the free states and territories in the North mostly relied in industry. Historians will tell you that there is a major difference between how these two areas approach the means of production, so the idea that slavery gave industry a massive boost would imply that these two things intertwined with one another, which is not the case in the slightest, considering that the industrial North banned slavery. When I think of industrial boost, I most certainly don't think of slavery. I think about the economic boost that happened during the baby boomer era, and all of it was a product of, you guessed it, industry. Here, this is another example of you stringing words together haphazardly, because you like to hear yourself talk.
You know why Trump says make America great again?
Yes, he said he wanted to make America great economically. He said he wanted jobs to return to America that were lost through massive amounts of job outsourcing deals that were left unfixed. He was aiming towards this utopianistic 1950s golden age of America, where people were working in massive automobile factories in Detroit and mining coal. Unfortunately, when Donald Trump became president, all we really got was tax cuts and perpetuating endless wars, pretty much no different from any other president since Ronald Reagan.
It's because America used to be great. Used to be great because people used to be racist and own it.
Well, to be fair, racism on the part of Donald Trump's rhetoric was pretty evident, not only when considering the 1950s utopia that he was aiming for, but his attitude towards crime. You will often see him dog whistling about the dangers of minority groups without explicitly saying that these are the minority groups he is talking about, calling them thugs, animals, or even anti-American. But that's not why America was considered great back in the day. America was great at that time, because the economy was boosting, inflation wasn't all too bad, and communities were in general a little safer. If we consider that this is really only beneficiary towards white people at the expense of other racial groups, then you may understand why America was better back in the day for many boomers. With that in mind, notice how I didn't include all the racist shit like segregation or Jim Crow, or any other shit that only affects people of color, because a lot of the good stuff from the 50s was in spite of the need for racism. Racism wasn't the driving factor of what made America quote-unquote great at that time. Hell, if America wasn't racist during that time, all of the things that I listed above wouldn't just apply to white people, but for all Americans. It seems like racism was the demotivating factor of making America greater than it was supposed to be.
People wore racism like a badge of honor.
Well shit, didn't know there was a Masonic sect of the Racist Tribunal of the Third Order. The Masons are officially cancelled. Alright, I think I should use this interjection to ponder in what fucking loser would actually be proud of being racist to this extent, like it's their crowning achievement above all else. Like, if they had two choices for achievements to be proud of, recreating the Burj Khalifa with a toothbrush, or hating on black and brown people, they will instantly pick hating on black or brown people above recreating the Burj Khalifa with a toothbrush. The worst part is that there are people like that. There are people out there who are so worthless in life that they need to wave their dicks around about how racist they are. They make it part of their personality and make a juxtaposition of their actual achievements and hold racism above all of them. What lifeless hacks, seriously.
Today we stigmatize racism, and thus America is no longer great again.
Ah yes, the reason why America is no longer great is not because of outsourcing deals or the isolation and atomization of the workers under a capitalist system that is becoming the second Gilded Age. No, America is no longer great because people are not dating black or brown people enough. With this in mind, I have a feeling that you are actually a CIA plant. You use racism to distract people from being conscious about class issues. You're indeed a saucy baka, aren't you?
We need slavery. We need a group of people who are expendable for manual labor.
No, we do not need slavery. We don't need to use humans for expendable labor. We are much better off than the days where we needed slavery, because the economy is in much greater shape than it previously was, and our technological progress is much greater than it was during the start of the Industrial Revolution.
China has been doing this with their own people, and they've become a global superpower from absolutely nothing.
Wait, didn't you just say previously in the video that we need to have ethno-states? You used China as an example of an ethno-state that people should strive towards, even though it's not an ethno-state, and now you're saying that China uses its own people as an expendable labor force, and they've grown to be a superpower from absolutely nothing. It seems like your ethno-state idea is starting to lose ground there, huh? Secondly, didn't you also say that, if we segregated each race and made sure that they kept with their own, they will be accountable for themselves without the perception that some other group is leeching off our hard work? Wouldn't slavery be the exact thing you are talking about, taking advantage of other people's hard work? What the fuck?
Imagine how powerful we could be if we took advantage of minorities and the racially inferior.
Wait, we are already powerful. We have the largest military, largest GDP, and we are neck and neck with the same country who's known throughout history for their riches. So no, we don't need to enslave other people. We are good.
We need a group of people we can oppress and use, and that shouldn't be people of the same blood.
Well, actually, according to many scientists, mitochondrial DNA sequences are pretty ambiguous regardless of race. If you don't know what mitochondrial DNA sequencing means, it's basically a series of ancestral DNA sequences that can be traced back to the mitochondrial Eve, meaning the common female ancestor. Two black people can have wildly different mitochondrial DNA chromosograms with each other, and a black and white person can have a relatively similar mitochondrial DNA sequence with each other, meaning they have a relatively common female ancestor. They may look similar phenotypically, so understandably you may think that they are related. But the problem is that this can transcend beyond racial lines, specifically the race labels that cover a broad geographic or phenotypic region of the human species, so it's no surprise that you're going to get a whole range of results contrary to what you preconceived to be true. Initially, haplogroups give a much more nuanced picture of phenotypic and genetic characteristics of different peoples, even more so than some made-up blob many people within society like to ascribe themselves regardless of epistemological accuracy. Look at this, how can you even tell? All the phenotypes and genetics are swimming around in this melting pot that we call Earth, and somehow, those with similar genetics are snugly placing themselves into separate boxes. So no, they are not all of the same blood, but we all bleed red however.
Without a group to take advantage of, the populace becomes discontent due to the unnatural workload, and development stagnates.
Yes, let's not make our people discontent, otherwise development will stagnate. In order to solve this, we should make other racial groups discontent by fucking enslaving them. That'll totally not make development stagnate at all. Hey, mind if I propose an alternative? How about use automation? Think about it. Instead of taking advantage of another racial group for slave labor, we should instead focus on taking advantage of automation to do all the backbreaking work. Automation won't start a rebellion. You don't need to whip them. They will get things done, and it would be a much more ethical means of production than treating your fellow man like absolute dog shit just so you could get the cotton picking done.
Okay, I realize I've been going on about the bigger picture for a bit too long, so what about the other side of things? How would being racist affect you, the viewer, positively? Well, to start with, we need to look at the basics of Jungian theory.
Jung. It's pronounced Jungian theory, not Jungian theory. We are not in the fucking jungle. We are not eating bananas in a tree or throwing shit at each other. Let's hope you are not interpreting his psychological findings as such obvious foreshadowing.
I don't expect many of you to understand this, as you kinda have to be in the know about this stuff. So I'll make this as simple as I can. Jungian theory expands off of Sigmund Freud's structure of the human psyche, with the id being our basest, most purest form of instinct. Both theories have one thing in common: the idea that our subconscious, the deep, dark, and repressed id, has a concrete effect on our conscious actions. Jung takes this one step further, saying that in order to complete ourselves, we must accept this subconscious manifestation of ours, not to reject it. The yin completes the yang, just as racism completes the soul.
No, and no. Firstly, as revolutionary Carl Jung and Sigmund Freud may be in the field of psychology, even one of them founding the field of psychology the way we understand it, most of their ideas are pretty outdated and even disproven. The whole id, ego, and superego idea may be helpful and somewhat pragmatic, but they are just deeply simplistic techniques that does very little when addressing mental health and the way we understand human nature. This isn't to say that the idea itself is bullshit and not worthy of consideration, it's just that there is more to it than just having the id as the primary force in our interactions. Also, Carl Jung isn't saying that we should just mindlessly accept whatever primitive instinct that we have. He is saying that we should just confront these instincts, and make it a utility to help yourself become a more rational person capable of bypassing them, and it starts by not rejecting them.
The struggles between id and superego can be the source of our growth and progress as individuals, but only if we are aware of them and understand them. Without that understanding of those half-tamed demons that live within us, we are enslaved by our unconscious drives and emotions.
The closest analogy is where a kid is afraid of the dark, and the kid's parents turn in the light switch to convince the child that there is nothing to be afraid of, and there are no monsters hiding under the bed or in the closet. In this case, getting in touch with your supposed id rather than letting the superego shame you, for it will serve as a light switch, convincing yourself there is nothing to be afraid of, and you can go back living a happy and normal life without having to worry about the urges affecting your life. This advice actually can help people with homosexual OCD or pedophilic OCD. The superego is telling you that if you thought of something, then that means you are a pedophile and the superego will shame you for it. Carl Jung says that we should turn on the light switch, and you can analyze your primitive instincts better that way and come to the realization that there is no pedophilic or homosexual nature in you, and with that, this whole thing will stop affecting your life. This actually gives you room to think about and analyze our primitive instincts rather than being shamed by the superego. However, your interpretation of Carl Jung's theory gives off horrible advice. If we just mindlessly cater to every last thing our so-called id offers us, or what we think our id is telling us, you're going to see a bunch of people running around with axes going on a rampage. You're going to see people shove gerbils up each other's asses and raping their cats. In the words of Ben Shapiro, they would screw everything inside and kill all their enemies. Both you and Ben Shapiro have one thing in common. You both believe that human beings are inherently disgusting. Ben Shapiro believes that we should have a leviathan in our lives to guide us, whether it be through religion, nation-states, etc. You on the other hand, believing that we should just act out on our worst qualities, and falsely interpret some of them as something that is innate within us. That's the dumbest fucking advice I've ever heard in my life. Why not just strive towards being good rather than acting out on your worst self when given the opportunity?
Don't lie to yourself neither. Being racist feels good. You're repressing your inner hatred by refusing to be racist, by refusing to generalize a race into one offensive caricature. But really, deep in your subconscious, you know that that's what they really are.
Point of personal privilege, Mr. Ottomagic Man. What, if I don't feel those things? What, if I am not internally racist in a subconscious level? Hate to break it to you, Achilles Argyle, but not everyone thinks the same way as you. If you are deeply racist in a subconscious level, then that's your problem. This is a trick in psychology. You will convince someone that they think something on a subconscious level, leading them to formulate thoughts in a field of chaos that's in their mind that can be interpreted as their primitive instinct, even though they can choose to interpret it however they want otherwise. They will say things along the lines of "don't lie to yourself," or "you know you want to be this way, don't you?" It's meant to mold people's perception on what they really want, and this is what Achilles Argyle is doing right now. In reality, you're just projecting.
You can't live without strife nor negativity. You need those elements of human life to balance yourself.
You're right, we need these elements to balance ourselves. But that's not what you're saying. You're asking us to be racist, which in some people is a primitive instinct. Knowing that we need a balance, the superego will just intervene and say that racism is bad, making people come to the realization that racism is not the right thing to do, because people are coming to their senses between right and wrong about relying on their primitive instinct. Hey, you said we should balance it out. Yeah, when you say balance it out, you mean just mindlessly following everything it tells you regardless of whether you perceive it as right or wrong. I know this, because every single human being hypothetically balances these made-up constructs, myself included. Hardly do I ever consider the idea of enslaving and slaughtering brown and black people, if at all, because I have maintained the balance between id and superego.
Accept it. Racism is chaos, and our minds are just as chaotic as it if we condemn racism deep down.
Man, that's just you, buddy. Your analogy of how the mind works is just a projection in your part.
The world that the left strives for is a non-existent realm of perfect euphoria, something that literally cannot exist.
Hey, even if you are correct, at least then we are striving towards something that is decent and positive. You know, I find it extremely ironic that you're condemning the left for being idealistic about their pursuits, striving towards a world that you say cannot exist, when you are striving towards a world where it is commonplace to have genocide and slavery. Not to mention, your ideology is also driven based on idealistic thinking, yet rather than being like the left and striving towards something better, you would rather pick a world where it is okay to have people as cattle and commit numerous war crimes against brown people. Just a reminder, folks, these are the people who are calling the left delusional. Don't feel guilty when they say that your ideal world isn't practical, when it's coming from people whose ideal world, in the other hand, only relies on human suffering, which by the way, literally cannot exist in our modern industrial world, and the extent to which it would exist would probably only be in underdeveloped third world countries. Fucking hell.
There's only one way it can exist, and let me tell you, it can only exist if we are not in it.
Yes, let's cast all of the ideas for a better world aside, because all of that can only exist if we are not in it. We should instead turn the clock backwards to a time where the world was objectively worse. Which way, Western man?
I really hate that there's such a social stigma against being racist
I wonder why.
because it served us so well before and yet we've cast it aside.
Serves who? Because all I'm really seeing really is racism only serving the powers that be. But what about the rest of the people? What the fuck do they get in return? This is another thing people in the right will try to justify. They will only view progress and prosperity to its maximum extent, only affecting one group of people, usually the powers that be, while the rest will only be left to suffer.
So, yeah, that's just my 2 cents on racism. Here's to hoping this video gains some traction and actually changes something. Anyway, make sure to leave a like and subscribe if you want to see more videos. I've got lots more to say.
Holy shit, you do? Given all of the shit that you've said in this video, I'm actually quite interested in where the rabbit hole would lead me, even though I've objected to almost everything you've ever said in this video.
Leave a comment too if you think you have something interesting to say. Please leave trolling out, you're not funny and we really don't need it.
Damn it, I was going to write a funny and interesting comment, and this is what it will say. Dear Achilles Argyle, you are stupid dumb two head bad guy, this isn't poggers, and this is going straight to my cringe compilation. No me gusta. r/forwards from Reddit. P.S. I'm from Germany, my English is good not. It's a shame that you would leave trolling out, because I'm such a masturbator.
I'll see you guys in the next video. Achilles Argyle, signing off.
Goodbye. And this is where the video ends. Overall, I honestly hope this guy is a troll. Many people have been saying that Achilles Argyle is actually a troll who made this video only to rile people up, so I am just going to go on a limb and conclude two things. Number 1, he is a troll who made this video to rile people up. I mean, there is so much substance in this conclusion. I mean, you got the furry avatar spewing out terrible opinions, pretty commonplace on YouTube by the way, and you got green fumes coming from the holes of his feet. What more evidence do you need? There is no way that this is not done by accident. For fuck's sake guys, this guy even said that he is going to make a video defending bestiality.
I've already scripted out several topics that I will be making videos about in the near future, including a video questioning modern society's views on bestiality. Bestiality.
On the other hand, the arguments that Achilles Argyle is presenting are actual arguments that racist people would make to justify their racism against other groups of people, down to the psychological and socio-political understanding that many racist people would have, leaving me to also believe that Achilles Argyle is doing all of those thought-terminating cliches as a means to troll shield, getting away with actually presenting racist arguments to the general public. Whatever the case may be, preferably the former, this video is overall pretty ineffective in explaining why we need to be racist against other groups of people. Instead, the existence of this video only benefits anti-racist people, making their ideas more palatable to political normies in the YouTube community. This is actually good news for the left. Thank you Achilles Argyle for making a video so objectively wrong and terrible that you are making it more likely for positive change within our society to occur, even though you are making justifications for human suffering. Anyway, I pretty much said everything I needed to say in this video, so I will just leave it at that. Anyway, this is Ottomagic Critic, and if you are new to this channel, make sure you subscribe, leave a comment, if you have something interesting to say, and share this video with all of your friends, and make sure Achilles Argyle also sees this monstrosity. See you next time.